Salams from the People's Dispatch studio in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. As you can see, we're back in our natural habitat today and we're talking about the newly released Oxfam report entitled Inequality Kills. We're also talking about a strike on Rikers Island prison in the United States, and we get our weekly COVID update from Prabir Purkayastha. First up, an Oxfam report, like I said, entitled Inequality Kills, released ahead of the World Economic Forum's Davos meeting, in clear terms, highlights the growing disparity in wealth and access that is leading to poverty, hardship, and death for millions around the world. The global briefing, for example, tells us that the pandemic has set back gender parity from 99 years to 135 years now. So that's almost 4 decades lost collectively for gender parity. Women collectively lost over $800 billion in earnings in 2020, with 13 million fewer women in work now than in 2019. The report has this and many more alarming numbers which paint a very dismal picture of the world we're living in. Prashant is on the show and back in studio. Prashant, what are some of the key highlights in terms of the numbers and the data that Oxfam has shared?
Right, Siddhant, you talked about how the report was titled Inequality Kills, and I think a very important number here to note is that inequality is contributing to the death of around 21,000 people each day, that is. And inequality is one of those things, which sometimes is a bit, people talk about it all the time, but I think reports such as these really paint the extent to which inequality is structural, one, and two, has its roots in almost every problem we see around us in the world today. And I think the report and previous Oxfam reports and the work of similar people across the world actually brings out some of these aspects. So, see, there are two aspects to it. One is actually to understand how the wealth of the richest people in the world has grown by a massive amount in the past 2 years, especially the years of the pandemic. So, the most simplest number for this is the fact that the 10 richest people in the world, they have seen their fortunes double from $700 billion to $1.5 trillion over the course of the past or the pandemic years, so to speak, the pandemic era, so to speak. So that's around $1.3 billion a day. Now imagine that's $1.3 billion a day that has increased in terms of just 10 people. Now if we take a slightly larger number of about say 100 people maybe, or 252 people actually. So these 252 people have more wealth than 1 billion women and girls in Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean combined. Or let's take the number further, which is the total number of billionaires in the world, and that's around 2,755. And these people have seen their wealth growing more in the past 2 years, in the pandemic years, than in the previous 14 years. And Oxfam makes it a point to know that even the previous 14 years were a boom time for billionaires, right? Yeah. I think the number is that there is a billionaire being created, the number of billionaires who are being created is at an immense rate. What do you call these days during the time of the pandemic. So all these actually show the massive amount of the way the economy is massively skewed, and this I think really shows us how we're structured today. And at the same time, while these top 10 people, their fortunes increased by doubled, the incomes of 99% of the world's people reduced. 160 million more people went into poverty because of in these 2 years alone, whereas these people are seeing such a massive amount of wealth. And like I said, this also plays into existing structural factors. You talked about the gender issue, for instance. You talk about race. Yeah. I think the latest numbers show that 3.4 million more black Americans would be alive if their life expectancy was at the same rate as white Americans. Right. Or for the fact that, I think in the second wave of the pandemic in the United Kingdom, people of Bangladeshi descent were 5 times more likely to die than white people. And all this, I think, kind of shows, or for that matter, if you look at the poverty, which I've given you numbers of, if, for instance, you take a look at hunger, the numbers are even more alarming. I think the numbers are like 1 in 3 people in the world did not have access to adequate food in 2020. So
1 in 3.
1 in 3 people, exactly. So all this kind of, shows the stark distinction between a very small percentage of a minuscule percentage of the world's population, and how it plays and how this inequality is really kind of affecting it. See, a lot of people, for instance, climate change is a very important topic we're all talking about, especially after the recent Glasgow meeting. And again, we see that the richest 1% emit more than twice as much as carbon dioxide as the bottom 50% of the world. So when people talk about climate change as though it's an issue everyone faces. The fact is, the real question is who really is responsible. And a report such as these numbers again show the way in which inequality of wealth, inequality of incomes, inequality of wealth, for instance, is a fundamental aspect that spans all our problems: gender, race, caste, ethnicity, hunger, whatever issue you take it. A lot of the inequality is really core to it. And it's also important to note, for instance, inequality is not something that just exists in the air like any of these other problems. It's a product of government policy.
Systems.
It is a product of how systems are structured. For instance, that is why this report is focused so much on the idea of economic violence. And it's a very important term I think we need to keep thinking about and talking about, because economic violence is what is being perpetrated on the vast majority of people in the world. And this is due to structural policy choices being made by governments, whether it is austerity, whether it is tax breaks given to the rich, whether it is bailouts. For instance, a massive amount of COVID-19 bailouts went actually to benefit the rich, went into financial markets from which these billionaires and billionaires benefited, whereas the people were not really able to benefit out of it. The refusal of governments to give minimum wages, for instance. So all these actually are what cause this inequality. So it's inequality, exactly. This inequality does not exist in some kind of vacuum. It is due to deliberate policy choices made by governments across the world. And we have to understand that these are especially a policy of the past 2 to 3 decades, where what is called neoliberal economics came into prominence. People began to believe, or economists began to say, that you just need to create wealth and it will trickle down. Whereas now, again and again, I think over the past many years, since the 2008 crisis, since in multiple crises after that, we have come to realize that there is no trickling down happening. And what all the wealth that is generated, for instance, is being increasingly concentrated. In fact, there is a lot of information about how wealth has been concentrated in the hands of a few people over the past 2 decades also. So I think what this report really illustrates is the massive structural flaws in the world economy right now.
And so, like we mentioned, coming out ahead of Davos, which is essentially a meeting of people that make policy and people that control big capital. So what does the report suggest in terms of means to address these glaring inequalities?
It's interesting you mentioned the Davos meeting, because the annual report that comes out ahead of the Davos meeting, the World Economic Forum's report, also focuses a lot on inequality, talking about some alarming numbers in terms of, for instance, if you look at the number of unvaccinated people, that's of course the important other thing that I forgot to mention. This concentration of wealth has been a huge problem in terms of vaccination, because pharma billionaires people have become billionaires in the pharma sector, whereas large sections of the population, especially in the poorer countries, remain unvaccinated. So again, I think there's an interesting number which says that if there was a 99% tax on only the money made during the pandemic by the 10 richest men, only the money made during the pandemic,
only the 10 richest,
only 10 richest men, that would be more than enough to not only vaccinate the entire world, but also provide a wide variety of social welfare policies for countries across the world. So this is again just on the extra wealth. It would still leave them with 8% more wealth than they had before the pandemic, these 10 people. So this is a good question, because I think one of the recommendations of the Oxfam report is that all this money has to be brought back into the real economy, and it has to be spent in ways that are socially beneficial. And I think this is a question which governments across the world are juggling with, but are mostly failing to, I think, answer. So on the one hand, for instance, you see China, of course, also has a lot of billionaires, but they've also done one of the biggest poverty eradication exercises over the past few decades, taking people out of absolute poverty. Whereas in the United States or in the more capitalist countries of the West, we have seen that governments are unwilling to even impose a fairly high amount of corporate tax. Or tax on the richest. For instance, when Joe Biden was trying to push for that, we saw pushback from the Republican Party and even some of the own Democrats, right? So the real challenge, the real question, I think what the Oxfam report says is that, this money has to be brought back into the real economy, into production, into wages, which, spur demand and which creates a healthy, booming real economy. And alongside that, the governments also need to pass policies which actually strengthen the vast majority of people who are working people. For instance, removing laws which prevent unionization, creating basic minimum wage laws, for instance. All these actually will go huge distance in sort of correcting this gap a bit. So it's a very, it's a very one of the big challenging questions of our time. And I think there's the famous philosopher Frantz Fanon had said that every generation has to discover its, promise, has to discover its challenge, and it has to either fulfill it or betray it. And I think one of the challenges ahead of us is really this question of inequality. So it's a big question before policymakers.
Absolutely, Prashant. Thanks very much for that update. Moving on now, over 200 detainees at Rikers Island, the main prison complex for the city of New York, continue to protest against living conditions in the troubled complex. The protest is unusual both in its size as well as its organization. The protesters have refused meals provided by the Department of Corrections, which oversees prisoner operations. We're going to switch out Prashant now for Anish, who's been covering this story, for more details. Anish, what's the latest you're hearing? What are protesting detainees telling us about conditions on Rikers Island?
So one of the first things we need to understand is that the Rikers Island, like it is one of the largest prison complex in the United States. We are talking about at least 8 active prisons that can, hold up to 10,000 in a day inmates as a maximum capacity.
Right.
So in this, we are also looking at one of the worst maintained prisons in the US as well, because at least for a decade now, most of these prisons have been going through crisis after crisis, and that has only exacerbated during the pandemic. Now, one of the major things that the prisoners are currently facing is the outbreak of COVID-19 among the inmates.
Right.
Now, close to 370 inmates have been infected in the past few weeks. And more than that, we're looking at positivity rate, which was hovering at 17% in the last week of December.
Wow.
And so it is, at this point, there's a complete shutdown on many of the wards. And many of these prisoners do not have any visiting time with people. They're pretty much under isolation and also going through kind of like a solitary confinement of sorts, because this means that none of their recreational time matters. None of them can leave their cells most of the time. So it actually affects them far worse. Most of them are unvaccinated. We're talking about vaccination, fully vaccinated being only about 38%, 39%. So this is, again, and we are also looking at another crisis, which is staffing shortages.
Yeah.
And this is a very concerted effort on the part of prison officials to actually pressure city officials to cave into their demands. Prison officials have been putting up, calling in leave sick or calling in sick for no good reason. For the past several months. This has been happening since at least July. On various episodes of at least about a third of prison officials being completely absent for very frivolous reasons, and that actually affects a lot of things in the prisons, especially delivery of food, maintaining minimum hygiene. We are talking about prisons,
all essential services.
Medical care. Again, at the time of the pandemic, medical care is something that is almost completely absent. That is one of the other demands that prisoners have been asking for, which is the frequent medical visits that used to happen before the pandemic has completely vanished now in most cases.
Right.
So many of them who may require hospitalization, many of them who may require some level of constant care are not being looked after by the prisons, by these prison officials and their management. And this actually comes at a time when the prisons are some of the most well-funded in the country. And so something close to about $800 million are being spent on the Rikers Island prison complexes. And we are looking at this point of time, looking at prisoners being underfed or like poorly fed. They're having to live in among pests. Many of the time, they're having to live with an outbreak that is not going down at any point. And it keeps happening. We're looking at a very poor maintenance, despite the fact that close to $500,000 is being spent on each of the prisoners, and nothing happens out of it.
So, with all of this context, Anish, what then are prison officials and the Department of Corrections doing to address, or are they doing anything at all to address the concerns that the prisoners have brought up?
Well, some of the things we need to understand, another context that we need to add is that city officials in the past have actually spoken about closing down the Rikers Island complex in the near past. but at the same, so they have brought down capacity during the pandemic. And so it used to be around 7,000, 8,000, sometimes some days even 10,000 inmates, but it has come down to anywhere between 4,000 to 6,000. So that they have done. But at the same time, there is almost studied silence by the new mayor, Eric Adams, who has pretty much said nothing about it. The Department of Corrections, on the other hand, is insisting that there's no hunger strike. They're saying that inmates are having food from another part of the mess, which is obviously there, like the part of the canteen that they share among them. Exactly, and this is not part of this is not maintained by the Department of Corrections. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there are a lot of them actually skipping meals entirely altogether. And 200 people, foregoing meals altogether is not something that can be taken lightly at any given point in time. But there is almost complete silence on their condition. We do not have much updates. Many of them do not get to meet their lawyers even. So in this scenario, we are looking at a city administration that is actually trying to appease the prison officials more than the inmates themselves, despite the fact that there is we saw at least 16 deaths documented last year, which was the deadliest in close to a decade, since 2013 at least. And despite that, prison officials and their union actually are trying to say, in many ways character assassinate these strikers. They're trying to malign them as among the rioters in the prison, even though these strikers have actually pointed out that riots are becoming more and more rampant inside these prisons.
Frequent violence.
Exactly, frequent violence, sometimes lethal violence we are talking about. So these facts are completely overlooked many of the times. Many of their demands have been accepted just a couple of days ago, and this shows how what kind of attitude the current administration is taking, even when the council is calling for completely shutting down the prison, and even though if it is in phases, but eventually shutting down these prisons, because we have to remember these prison complexes do not hold convicts. They are holding people who are pre-trial. Anything more than 80% of these inmates at any given point of time are pre-trial detainees.
Like a holding facility.
Exactly. They often do not spend more than few months, but even then they have to spend that amount of time in such squalid conditions. On top of that, many of the convicts that we are talking about, most of them are there to serve very short sentences for minor crimes or misdemeanors. So this is not the way you have to deal with when it comes to small crimes or misdemeanors, especially at a time when we are looking at police violence and systemic racism being opposed very widely for the past several years in the United States, and completely overlooking that as part of the incarceration system is not something ideally a democratic administration should be doing in the US.
Absolutely. Important update that, Anish. Thanks very much. And finally, our last bit on the show today, because it is a Monday, is our weekly COVID-19 update from India and around the world with Newsclick Editor-in-Chief Prabir Purkayastha, who I had the chance to speak to a little while earlier via video conference. Prabir, good to have you back on the show once again. You have been giving us regular updates on the COVID-19 situation, of course, as it's affecting India, as well as wider inferences from the data and from learnings from around the world. For this week, Prabir, what are some key points that you would like to bring up?
If you look at India, for instance, and I'm going to discuss that the first, it's very clear that the urban centers went up very quickly. Started with Calcutta, Mumbai, Delhi, now it's Bangalore. So the characteristics seem to be very similar, whichever city you take anywhere in the world. That you have a vertical rise, virtually a vertical rise, and then you start to have a plateauing. And it comes down pretty quickly after that. So that's the characteristic. Of course, it will never come down as fast as it goes up. So that is always there. But nevertheless, it starts to fall pretty quickly because it seems to burn itself out faster than all other variants because it also infects a lot more. So you have both this characteristic that's happening. And this is something you see across the world. But the point is that this is not a country's numbers. It's really a set of clusters that you see. Each cluster behaves independently. And then, of course, it has its own dynamic. And as a set of clusters, they sort of start coming down, the new set of clusters start. And that's how, when you add all of it up, you see what is called a country's rise. So that's true for the United States, France, the UK, which are still, I think the France numbers, US numbers are still pretty high. UK numbers seem to be coming down as of now. But again, if you see, it is really London first, then other areas. So that's a characteristic you see in India as well. And you are going to see these numbers go up or stabilize at pretty high numbers as the rest of the states, rest of the cities follow suit, what we have seen. So that's how you get a much larger flat wave that you see, rather than a steep climb and then fall as individual cities tend to do. But the one thing two things I think we should be very clear about in this, what we are seeing is that the numbers that are being talked about as the new cases per day, this does not represent the new cases because there's a lot more tests taking place, which now you have home test, you have rapid antigen test. So therefore, the numbers actually tested and found positive probably are much larger than what we are seeing. But that's not surprising. That's what happened earlier also, when it was said that the Indian numbers are anything between 6 to 30 times larger than what was really registered. So that's something which is not uncharacteristic of what has happened elsewhere as well. That is one part. The second part of it, the hospitalization has been relatively lower. We expect after 2 weeks of the wave hitting, when the numbers start going up, you will see hospitalization numbers also rise and also deaths starting to rise maybe 3 weeks to 4 weeks after that. That's not a characteristic we are seeing today, except that the numbers among the unvaccinated, that's what we are seeing from the US as well, that the numbers of the unvaccinated who are reaching intensive care is higher than those who are vaccinated. And therefore, there is, because the absolute numbers are high, there is a pressure on the hospitals still, because hospitals are also facing a shortage of staff. They're also falling ill. So you have this double crisis, numbers rise, hospital staffs fall ill, and there is a pressure. So you do see intense pressure in a lot of the hospitals in the US. As yet, Indian cities still don't seem to have entered that phase. So the numbers are, as I said, even in the hospitals, intensive care are going up. And the unvaccinated tend to be the ones who end up by being in intensive care or, more sick, needing oxygen support and so on. So given all of this, it doesn't seem to have stressed Calcutta, Bombay, hospitals that much, Delhi that much, as you might have expected. So yes, some positive signs yet, but one should be very cautious not to be over enthusiastic of thinking it is a minor flu kind of thing. It is still serious. It is still going to have its impact, and we are going to see numbers in critical care or even deaths rise as it goes on. So I think we have to take all that into account, and hopefully that the people who are vaccinated will be protected from at least serious diseases. Government of India has made some rules for now, adding what is called the booster dose. They call it precautionary dose. But the numbers that are being offered at the moment, since it's 39 weeks after the second dose, that means very few are eligible for it. So it's not going to make an impact for this phase of the pandemic. At least this phase, this is not going to be useful. If there's another wave, then yes. Otherwise, I don't think this is not the additional dose is not going to make any impact on what we see at the moment.
Praveen, you were mentioning the data in terms of hospitalization, vaccinated versus non-vaccinated individuals. In India and broadly in the global south, the two, unlike in the US or the UK perhaps, where access to hospital care is possible even among the sections that are non-vaccinated. In India, perhaps some of this is also in the south, this is also somewhat different because the same people that perhaps don't have access to the vaccine also don't have access to any kind of hospital care either.
You know, even if that is partially true, the fact remains that a lot of them will still reach hospital. There are public hospitals, there are government hospitals where they have to admit serious patients. So I don't think that's strictly true, but it is true that yes, they will not have access to the private hospitals as much as the middle class or the relatively well off do. So that part is really true. But at the same time, the pressure last time, as we saw, was from all sections. And even the rich did not get seats in the hospital, even if they wanted to. So I think that part of it is clear that the pressure on the hospital this time is less, but the unvaccinated, it is true if it is from rural areas, they have even more difficulty of accessing. But if you take the main cities, I think they do get access to hospitals, even if they're not the best in terms of providing care of cleanliness and so on, which we'd like hospitals to have. So that is true. So I think the pressure not being there is real. The unvaccinated not getting access is not the reason why we don't see the pressure in the hospitals as yet.
Right, that's all we have on the show for today. From me and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. We'll be back again, same place, same time tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.